On an autumn evening of the 22nd of October 1989, an incident occurred that changed the lives of many people. Jacob was riding bicycles with his younger brother Trevor and his best friend Aaron Larson returning from a 24-hour store. Suddenly, a masked stranger emerged from the bushes, holding a dangerous object in his hand. He ordered the three boys to lie down on the ground face down. The stranger asked each one his age and then instructed everyone except Jacob to leave without turning around. Since then, Jacob has not been seen. This story led us to St. Joseph, a small town in Stearns County, Minnesota, where about 7,000 people live. Many young professionals have settled here. There is the College of St. Benedict, a career park, and a nature reserve. The place appears ideal for nature lovers. But it was precisely in this quiet corner that something terrible happened in October 1989. Jacob saw the light of the world on the 17th of February 1978 in the small town of Long Prairie, Minnesota. His parents, Jerry and Patty Wetterling, welcomed their firstborn with joy. Over time, the younger brother Trevor and two sisters Amy and Carmen joined the family. The 6 family members lived in a cozy house in St. Joseph, a small town in the heart of Minnesota. The atmosphere in their home was always filled with warmth and cheerfulness. Jacob grew into an active and friendly boy. He was enthusiastic about music, loved animals, and participated in several school sports groups. Everyone knew him as a joker with a good heart. Jacob studied diligently and was particularly interested in natural sciences. Astronomy fascinated him most. With his younger brother Trevor, he loved to ride bicycles. The parents set no limits on this hobby. The boys explored the surroundings with pleasure and enjoyed the feeling of freedom during their bike tours through the city. No one could have suspected that one of these ordinary rides would become a turning point in the family's life that would divide it into a before and an after. On the 22nd of October 1989, a Sunday, nothing indicated misfortune. The Wetterling family spent this holiday at home, resting and going about everyday activities. In the evening, Jerry and Patty drove to dinner with friends in Clearwater, about 30 kilometers from their home. Jacob, the oldest of the children, was supposed to watch the younger ones. The parents wanted everyone to stay home. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, after the parents had left, Jacob called his mother. He asked for permission to ride bicycles with Trevor to the 24-hour Tom Thumb store to get a movie. Patty declined and explained that it was already dark and the younger children would be without supervision. The boys were disappointed but did not give up. They immediately called their father. They promised to be careful, wear safety vests, and take flashlights. The store was about 1 kilometer away. They also said they had arranged with a teenage girl from the neighborhood to watch the younger children. Jerry, who understood how much the boys wanted to go to the store, agreed. Jacob immediately called his best friend Aaron Larson, who came over shortly after. All three set off to the video store with their bicycles. The boys reached the video store safely. After a few minutes of choosing, they rented an action comedy film. Then they got back on their bicycles and headed home. They rode slowly, since it had already become dark, and they had to illuminate the path with flashlights. After a short distance, they found themselves in an unpleasant situation. A masked man stepped from a driveway onto the street and blocked their way. The situation escalated when he pointed an object that resembled a weapon at them and demanded that they get off their bicycles. The stranger ordered them to place the bicycles at the roadside and lie down on the street. Then he asked each one his age. When he learned that one of them was younger than the others, he instructed him to slowly get up and go to the nearest forest. He warned that the boy would regret it if he made even a sound or turned around. The frightened boy obediently followed the instructions. The masked man then turned to the two remaining boys and demanded they look at him. After brief consideration, he seemed to focus on one of them. He ordered the second boy to get up and slowly go to the forest, threatening him in the same way as the first. He also followed the instructions. He slowly stood up, cast a last glance at his friend who remained on the street, then turned around and walked toward the forest where the first boy had gone before. This was the last time Jacob was seen in a normal environment. Trevor and Aaron, although greatly frightened by what had happened, understood that their friend was in a much more difficult situation. They hurried back to Jacob and Trevor's house where the neighbor's daughter was watching the girls. When she saw the boy's condition, she immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation and called her father, Merlin Jacob. Merlin came immediately and contacted Patty and Jerry, who were at dinner, and also alerted the police. Jacob's parents quickly returned home, shaken by the news. Soon after, extensive search operations began. Numerous officers from the Stearns County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene. However, a serious mistake was made in the early phases of the investigation. Not all residents of the surrounding houses were questioned. In such cases, it is extremely important to speak with all persons in the vicinity of the incident within the first 24 hours. This is because people's memories are still fresh, and the probability of having noticed something unusual is higher among those who were nearby. But the police officers, too confident of solving the situation quickly, did not undertake all necessary steps for thorough investigations. The law enforcement agencies concentrated their efforts on searching for Jacob using ground and air resources. At the scene, they questioned Dan Rassier, who lived in immediate proximity to the place where Jacob had disappeared. Dan shared an observation. On that fateful night, he noticed a small car that drove into his driveway and stopped shortly after. After some time, the driver abruptly turned around and drove back the same way, presumably because he realized the road ended in a dead end. The investigators suspected this might be connected to the incident. The specialists discovered tire tracks near the crime scene, which were registered as potential evidence. Due to the proximity to the crime scene, Dan also came onto the list of persons of interest for the investigations. Sheriff Charlie Graft from Stearns County remembers his initial expectations of a quick solution to the case, given the prompt reaction of the police. This should have significantly limited the suspect's escape possibilities in his opinion. However, as the further investigation showed, these expectations proved premature. The first night of the search ended around 3 o'clock in the morning due to insufficient visibility conditions. The same morning at 8 o'clock, the law enforcement officers resumed the search for Jacob. FBI agents joined the Stearns County Sheriff's Department employees to help with both the search operation and the investigations. A day later, an FBI profiler was added. Based on the known facts of the incident, he suspected that the sought person was most likely a single white man with a physical peculiarity and had possibly already committed similar actions before. On the 25th, a prayer gathering took place in St. Joseph's Church. More than 500 people came to pray for Jacob's safe return. The next day, the news about the incident was broadcast throughout the country, and entrepreneurs from Minneapolis and St. Paul offered a reward of $100,000 for the boy's safe return. On the 27th, National Guard soldiers together with the State Patrol joined the search. In the attempt to find Jacob, they searched an area of 2,000 square kilometers. This search operation became one of the largest in the history of the USA, and the case received great media attention nationwide. People showed their support for Jacob's family in various ways. Many wore white ribbons on their clothing as a symbol of hope and participation in the search. In the search for the missing Jacob, people hung thousands of notices in shops and on windows. Even in pizza boxes, flyers were included. Radio stations throughout Minnesota played Jacob's favorite song together with a message from his mother, Patty. Before the internet age, these were the main ways to report on such cases. Hundreds of volunteers came forward to help with the search. Tracking dogs were used to pick up a trail. But all efforts remained unsuccessful. At the end of the first week, on the 29th of October, more than 100 agents and officers from various agencies were working on the case. Unfortunately, no clues were found. Many criticized the law enforcement agencies for the search being too extensive and hasty. It was believed that they should have first concentrated on a small area around the crime scene and thoroughly questioned everyone present before expanding the area. In November 1989, the investigators showed the public 3 different portraits of a man who had been seen in the Tom Thumb store on that fateful night. Witnesses reported that this man had been watching customers attentively. Description of the person: light-skinned, about 50 years old, approximately 90 kilograms heavy, with grey hair. 6 days later, on the 12th of November, the law enforcement officers published 2 more portraits. On showed a man who had eavesdropped on conversations in the Tom Thumb store some weeks after the incident. The other portrait depicted a person who had presumably tried to lure away a young man in New Brighton, a suburb of Minneapolis. The law enforcement officers noticed the similarity of both images with the previously created portrait of the person who was seen in the Tom Thumb store on the evening of Jacob's disappearance. After the publication of these pictures, the police received numerous calls, but none led to results. On the 30th of November, a composite portrait was published that was considered the most accurate. It combined the features of the 3 previous images. Although the investigators again received a series of tips, none led to concrete information. On the 13th of December, FBI agents spoke with Jared Scheil, who had become the victim of an assault in Cold Spring in January 1989. Investigators from the neighboring town suspected that both cases could be connected to the same person. The FBI met with Jared so he could help create a portrait of the perpetrator. On the 16th of December, FBI agents interrogated a possible suspect named Daniel James Heinrich from Paynesville, which is about 48 kilometers from St. Joseph. In this area, there had been several incidents with young men in recent years, apart from the cases with Jacob and Jared. When questioned by FBI agents, Heinrich explained that he knew nothing about the situations with Jacob and Jared. The investigators once again faced a dead end and considered how to continue the investigation. A month later, on the 12th of January 1990, attention turned again to Heinrich. This time he agreed to provide his sneakers and samples for analysis for possible evidence. 3 days later, Heinrich allowed an impression to be made of the tires of his blue Ford Expo hatchback from 1982 to compare it with the tracks found at the location of Jacob's disappearance. The next day, it turned out that Heinrich had owned another car until March 1989, a Mercury Topaz from 1989. This meant that if he was involved in the incident with Jared, he would have had to use this car. The police gained access to the Mercury Topaz. When Jared was asked to evaluate the similarity of this car to the one he had been in a year ago, he gave an assessment of 8 or 9 out of 10. On the 24th of January, Heinrich's apartment was searched. Various items were confiscated, including police scanners, a bag for their transport, frequency lists, shoes and clothing. 2 days later, Heinrich was summoned to the police for an identification procedure. Jared stood before 6 light-skinned men. At this moment, he could not precisely determine whether the one who had taken him away was among them. Jared rated the similarity with Heinrich at only 4 out of 10 points. On the 9th of February 1990, the FBI received an important tip. Fibers from Jared's clothing matched fibers from Heinrich's car that he had owned in January 1989. On the same day, Heinrich was arrested on suspicion of involvement in the incident with Jared. However, he denied any involvement. Due to lack of direct evidence, Heinrich was soon released without charges. Meanwhile, the number of investigators working on Jacob's case gradually decreased, as did the number of theories to investigate. Although the case could not officially be closed since the search for missing persons must continue, the investigation reached a dead end. This entire time of search and investigation became a severe trial for Jacob's family. Despite the enormous support from locals and people from across the country, the boy's relatives were deeply saddened by his absence. With time, they increasingly wondered whether they would ever see Jacob again. In this difficult time, Patty Wetterling decided to support other families in similar situations so they would not have to go through the same trials as she and her relatives. On the 16th of January 1990, she announced the founding of the Jacob Wetterling Foundation. The organization's goal became to educate society about people who commit unlawful acts against young citizens, about their methods, and about how everyone can help prevent such cases. Despite the difficulties experienced, the family decided to use their experiences to help others. Jacob's story also influenced USA legislation in this area. In the year 1994, a federal law was passed that was named after Jacob Wetterling. It was a turning point in the history of the USA. A new law came into effect that obligated every federal state to register a certain category of offenders. Over time, this law helped many people in solving missing person cases and left a long-lasting trail. Despite all the efforts of the Wetterling family to help others, they themselves still did not know what had happened to their son Jacob. They continued to hope for his return, although this hope diminished over the years. At this point, Joy Beggar entered the case, a mother of 2 children who began to take interest in Jacob's case in the year 2010. She traveled to the location of his disappearance in St. Joseph. When Jacob disappeared in 1989, Joy was 22 years old. Now that she was there, she felt the need to find answers. Not knowing where to start, Joy drew on her experience as a blogger. On the 23rd of October 2010, she published an article titled, "Somewhere is Jacob." At this time, 21 years had passed since his disappearance. Joy did not suspect that this would be the beginning of a journey that would occupy the next years of her life and lead to unexpected discoveries. She carefully documented every step of her investigation in her blog. Joy delved into the case with sincere interest, asking questions and exploring all possible leads. She studied old police files and newspaper clippings, searching for details about this incident. Soon she noticed that some mistakes had been made in the initial investigations. As a result, the officers had overlooked important leads, handled evidence incorrectly, and sometimes even lost it. Additionally, they had not questioned some key witnesses. The investigations were so thorough that in one of the notes, even the weather conditions and the position of the moon on the night of Jacob's disappearance were discussed. This helped understand that it would have been difficult for witnesses to recognize the perpetrator's vehicle, since the moon had not yet fully risen and everything happened in dense darkness. While she continued gathering information about the 10-year-old case, she came across someone who had also been involved in the initial investigations. His name was Jared Sherrill. In the meantime, Jared had grown into a 30-year-old man, but he still thirsted for justice after what he had experienced in his youth. Jared and she joined forces. The real breakthrough came when they discovered an old newspaper article from the year 1987. It reported on a series of suspicious incidents with young men that had occurred in the years 1986 to 1987. All incidents happened in a similar way, by a masked person near the small town of Painesville, which is only a half-hour drive from the location of Jacob's disappearance. With Jared's help, Joy managed to identify several affected individuals. It turned out that these were now adult men who also wanted to learn the truth about the events that had happened to them many years ago. Jared and Joy together marked the locations of each incident on a map, thus creating the so-called Painesville cluster. Shocked by the information they had gained, they turned it over to law enforcement agencies. Subsequently, the police resumed the investigations that had been on ice for years. Unexpectedly, the case attracted great attention again, and Joy's blog became popular on the internet. Since the police resumed the investigations, the story once again came into the focus of the entire country. In the year 2015, 26 years after Jacob's disappearance, the investigations received new momentum. The police had an important piece of evidence, a DNA profile that was found on Jared's clothing on the day of the incident. On the 10th of July 2015, it turned out that this profile matched a man who is now 59 years old and retired. It was Daniel James Heinrich. He had already appeared in the original investigations and was in the focus of Joy and Jared. But there had been no concrete evidence so far. This evidence made it possible to bring the case to court. On the 27th of October 2015, Special Investigator Shane Ball filed a sealed criminal complaint against Heinrich with Magistrate Jeffrey J. Keyes. At this point, the statute of limitations in Jared's case had expired, and Heinrich was charged on 20 counts of other offenses. Subsequently, he was arrested and the case went to court. Heinrich's lawyers negotiated a deal in which he would only be charged for other offenses that were not connected to Jacob's disappearance. In return, Heinrich showed the police on the 31st of August 2016 the location where Jacob was. It was a farm near Painesville, about 48 kilometers from St. Joseph, close to Heinrich's former residence. On the 6th of September 2016, 27 years after the incident with Jacob, Heinrich appeared in court. He confessed that on the 22nd of October 1989 he had kidnapped Jacob and subsequently performed inappropriate actions. Heinrich also admitted his involvement in the case of Jared Scheil earlier in the same year. He told the court that he was driving on the road when he noticed 3 young passers-by. He turned into a driveway and waited until they passed by. Then he took Jacob and ordered the other 2 to flee. After that, he drove with Jacob to Painesville, to an area familiar to him. There sad incidents occurred, about which Heinrich reported to the court. He left Jacob in a secluded corner of a gravel pit near the sewage system on Pond Road. Then he returned home and waited a few hours. After midnight, he drove there again and brought Jacob further north to a construction area. There he found an excavator that he could operate. With its help, he prepared a spot and carefully placed Jacob there. About a year later, he returned and noticed that the location had been partially disturbed. Jacob's red t-shirt was visible. This troubled him. He decided to bring everything he could collect via the highway to a farm in Pennsville and to carefully place everything there again. In January 2017, the court sentenced him to 20 years imprisonment for his actions. With the discovery of Jacob and the confession of the guilty party, the years-long investigations ended in one of the most serious incidents in the history of the USA. After the conclusion of the case, the Wetling family was able to hold a dignified farewell ceremony for Jacob at the cemetery of the Friends of St. John's Abbey in College Village, Stearns County, Minnesota. Joy Baker, who tried to help with the investigations, became a close friend of the Wetling family. She emphasized that she had never strived for recognition or fame when she became involved in this case. She was simply a mother who wanted to support another mother in a difficult time. Patty and Joy grew closer and together wrote a book about their story titled Dear Jacob, A Mother's Journey. Patty became known through her commitment to protecting youth and her help in passing federal legislation. Jacob's relatives suffered a deep shock when they received the final news about his fate. Patty admits that it is unbearably difficult to comprehend what Jacob had to go through in his final days and hours. She says that Jacob was alive for her the whole time until the final confirmation came. And although they now know with certainty that their beloved son is no longer there, his legacy lives on through the foundation that was established and the federal law passed in his honor. The foundation ensures that people like Heinrich are held accountable for their actions. The young woman disappeared on the way from the bus stop to her house. The law enforcement officers began the search and assumed that it would be an uncomplicated case. To general surprise, however, this case developed into one of the most tangled and sensational stories in the criminal history of Great Britain. Although the investigations were officially concluded quite soon, the consequences continued to cause heated discussions to this day. Helen McCourt saw the light of the world on the 29th of July 1965 in the English small town of Bootle. Soon the family was expanded by a younger brother, whom Helen cared for from a young age. Later the parents separated. Helen's mother started a new family, and they moved to the tranquil village of Billinger near the city. Billinger was known for its peace. Serious incidents were a rarity here. The residents knew each other well and felt safe. In this peaceful atmosphere, Helen grew up, surrounded by friends, and delighted her parents with her behavior. After completing her education, the young woman found employment with an insurance company in Liverpool. She remained living in Billinger and commuted daily by train and bus to the office. On the 9th of February 1988, Helen set off to work as usual. Originally, she and her mother had planned to have lunch together since they worked near each other. But the weather suddenly deteriorated. Strong wind came up and it began to rain. Therefore, they decided to postpone the joint lunch to another day. Helen's mother usually came home earlier than her daughter. Shortly before the end of work, Helen called her and told her that she had a date in the evening. She asked to keep dinner warm for her so that she could still get ready. Normally, Helen came shortly after 17 o'clock, but on this day she was obviously late, which worried her mother. Soon after, it was reported in the news that a tree had fallen on the railway tracks due to the storm, which temporarily affected train traffic. Around 19 o'clock in the evening, when the mother became worried again, she decided to call the railway company. After she had explained the situation, she learned that the problem with the tree had occurred in another section, and Helen's route had not been affected. At this point, the woman began to seriously worry about her daughter. Helen almost always came home on time and always informed about delays. Despite the absence of mobile phones, she could call from work or from one of the numerous public telephone booths. The mother thought that something unpleasant might have happened to Helen due to the storm. For example, heavy rain and wind could have led to a fall and an injury. The worried mother and her son began calling the surrounding hospitals, hoping to find someone who looked similar to Helen. But their search remained unsuccessful. Assuming that the daughter might have stayed longer at work, the woman contacted the office. There she was told that Helen had already left the workplace several hours ago. Even the young woman's friends had no idea where she might be. Thereupon the mother, the stepfather, and Helen's friend decided to search for themselves. They followed the young woman's usual route from work to home. Helen always took the same way. She got on the train in Liverpool, travelled to St. Helens, and from there by bus to Wiston. After they had found no trace of Helen, the family turned to the police. The officers immediately informed their colleagues in Liverpool and the surrounding area and spread a description of the missing person, but the search remained without result. The next morning, when Helen still had not appeared and had not made contact, the police officers began to reconstruct her route and the course of the evening. They had to find out at which point of her way the young woman had disappeared. The investigators turned to the public for help and questioned Helen's colleagues, railway station employees, and bus companies. Finally, they came to an unexpected conclusion. The investigators confirmed that the young woman had indeed taken the train and subsequently the bus to her village that evening. This caused confusion, since it was only a stone's throw from the bus stop to her apartment, just 200 meters. The investigators began to consider the possibility that something unpleasant might have happened to Helen on the way home, because in an ordinary incident, they would have already found her. They began to check Helen's close environment, since in such situations acquaintances are frequently involved. Her friend and her stepfather had solid alibis for that evening. Friends and acquaintances of the young woman were also excluded from the circle of suspects. With search teams of 120 officers, the police carefully combed through the area between the bus stop and Helen's house. They searched for all possible clues, pieces of clothing or objects that someone strange might have lost. At the same time, information about the young woman's disappearance was spread in the surrounding localities. Divers examined nearby waters while police officers went from house to house and questioned the residents. They also visited all the shops, pubs, and cafes in Billing. The conversation with the staff of the pub, George and Dragon, provided the first clue, since this establishment was located near Helen's house and she occasionally frequented there with friends. The investigations revealed that the owner of the establishment had refused Helen access to the bar a few days before the incident because of an unpleasant incident. She had had an argument with a drunk visitor who had accidentally spilled a drink over her. Helen wanted no quarrel and went to the toilet to freshen up, but the woman followed her and showed aggressive behavior. The situation escalated so far that the unknown woman tried to strike at Helen. Finally, the bar owner asked both to leave the establishment and not to return. To clarify this story, the officers visited the bar the next day to speak with the owner, Ian Simps. Moreover, this place was exactly on Helen's way from the bus stop home. Ian reported about that evening and explained that he had to ask both women to leave in order not to disturb the other guests. During the conversation, the bar filled with people, and it became loud. The police officers suggested to Ian to continue the conversation at the station, where it would be quieter. And then, something strange happened. The man became visibly nervous, refused to drive with them, and tried to end the conversation. This aroused the suspicion of the investigators. Could he have something to do with Helen's disappearance? They decided to examine Ian's personality more closely and learned about his reputation as a womanizer. Despite his marital status and 2 children, Ian constantly flirted with other women, and this was known to all locals. The law enforcement officers also found out that this man often paid Helen special attention. When she visited his establishment, he offered her free treats and tried to start a conversation, but the young woman showed no interest. This behavior of a married man with 2 children seemed strange to her. The investigators visited him again and inquired what he had been occupied with on the evening of Helen's disappearance. The man told that he had spent time with a close acquaintance in the room above his establishment. According to his words, he often spent the night there because he was concerned about the security of his business. The investigators spoke with the mentioned lady, and here an unexpected discovery awaited them. The woman shared that they had indeed agreed to meet around 7 o'clock in the evening. On that day, however, he had called her and asked her to come much later. Finally, she appeared around 7:30, but the owner was not there. He only returned shortly before 11. This seemed extremely suspicious. Obviously, Ian had not told the police the truth about his whereabouts, which immediately drew the investigators' attention to him. Another detail struck the investigators as unusual. Fresh marks were visible on the man's neck. He explained that he had received them during an argument with his wife when she learned of his affair. In conversation with the wife, however, she denied having touched her husband in any way. The police officers spoke with Ian again, and his story changed. Now he claimed the marks had occurred when he separated Helen and another intoxicated visitor that evening when a confrontation broke out in the pub. The investigators spoke with the mentioned woman, and she also did not confirm this story. According to her words, there was no scuffle, and none of them left marks on the bar owner. Soon the police had a witness who gave them disturbing information. On the evening when Helen disappeared, he was walking down the street and suddenly heard a shrill female scream. The sound came directly from the bar but quickly fell silent. Given all the circumstances, the investigators began to suspect that Ian Sims might be connected to the mysterious disappearance of the young woman. However, he continued to deny everything. The investigators needed solid evidence to connect him to the case, otherwise they would end up in a dead end. During the examination of Ian's vehicle, the officers made 2 disturbing discoveries. The first was several stains of unknown origin. The second was a women's earring on the vehicle floor. The piece of jewelry was shown to Helen's mother, who identified it with certainty as her daughter's. Ian was then arrested on suspicion of involvement in Helen's disappearance, although her fate was still uncertain. During the search of the bar and the apartment on the first floor, new evidence was found. In both locations, barely visible traces were discovered that had apparently been wiped away. On one of these stains, experts found a fingerprint from Ian. In the apartment, they also found the missing part of the earring from the car. Despite the evidence collected, the man continued to deny everything. The investigators suspected that something terrible had happened to Helen, but they had to find her. Otherwise, the court might acquit Ian. They assumed that the traces in the bar, the apartment, and in the car were connected to the young woman. In those years, however, DNA analysis was just beginning to be used in criminology, and conducting such an examination was not simple. Ian himself claimed the traces came from his dog, which had injured its paw. To advance the investigation, the investigators turned to the public and asked for help with a more extensive search. More than 2,000 people volunteered, including locals and residents from neighboring communities. Volunteers searched the surroundings of Billinger thoroughly together with law enforcement, including the forests and fields. Soon there was a new lead in the case. but it was not discovered by a volunteer. 25 kilometers from the village, in the locality of Hollins Green, a man walking his dog noticed a towel with suspicious stains on the ground. Upon closer inspection, he found another similar towel and several pillowcases. Next to them lay men's socks, a sweater and underwear. Disturbing traces were visible on some clothing items. The man reported the find to the police, and the items were taken for examination. However, there was a complication. Due to the distance from Billinge, officers from another station came to the scene. They made no connection between this find and Helen McCourt's disappearance. For this reason, the investigators who were entrusted with her search did not even know about the discovery of these items. Finally, the police officers recognized a connection between these cases. They were helped by the inscription on the found sweater. On the found item was a print advertising a beer brand that was currently being sold on special offer at the George and Dragon Bar. When the investigators learned of this, they suspected that all these items most likely belonged to Ian Simps. The investigators had many samples for analysis, but they lacked an important piece of evidence to request a more detailed examination. In the year 88, such methods were not yet widespread. The police decided to compare the samples from the bar, from Simps's car, and from the found items with analyses from Helen's close relatives, her parents, and her younger brother. The results showed a very close match, which practically guaranteed a family relationship. This strengthened the investigators' conviction that the traces belonged to Helen and clearly pointed to Ian's involvement in her disappearance. The problem was that courts in Great Britain extremely rarely handed down guilty verdicts in such cases without the main evidence. However serious the evidence might be, in the eyes of justice, there always remained the slightest possibility that the missing person might still be alive. The police hoped to gather more information against Ian and questioned all his acquaintances. A conversation with the bar's cleaning lady revealed a new suspicious episode. The woman reported that she had come to work as usual the morning after Helen's disappearance to clean the premises. To her astonishment, the woman found the owner doing a thorough cleaning. He was eagerly scrubbing floors, walls, and tables, and apparently had been occupied with this for quite a while. The strange thing about the situation was that such a thing had never happened before. Normally, the man was still sleeping in his apartment upstairs when the cleaning lady came for the early shift. To the astonished question about the reason for this sudden cleanliness, Ian explained that his dog had allegedly made a mess. Another witness reported to law enforcement that he had heard the sound of a running vacuum cleaner when he passed by the bar that night. Law enforcement suspected that Ian had spent the entire night eliminating some traces, but had not succeeded completely. Despite the accumulating suspicious facts, the case was still not brought to court. The investigators continued searching for the missing woman, but even large-scale operations brought no results. A month later, a new clue surfaced. A passerby walking along the riverbank about 30 kilometers from Billings noticed a women's handbag in the grass. When he looked inside, he found documents in the name of Helen McCourt. The police officers who arrived at the scene soon found even more evidence. Nearby, they discovered clothing in which the young woman had been seen on the day of her disappearance, as well as the second earring that matched the one found in Ian's car. Further investigations, however, led the investigators to an even more disturbing find. Nearby, a tangle of cable was discovered in which strands of hair were entangled. Laboratory analysis confirmed that they belonged to Helen McCourt. During the examination of the young woman's bag, the investigators found a receipt from a pharmacy in St. Helens. It turned out that Helen had been shopping there on the evening when she was last seen, shortly before she took the bus to Billinger. The police officers found all the purchased items next to the handbag with the exception of a toothbrush. Strangely, the missing hygiene item was not found 30 kilometers from the village where the handbag lay, but in Ian Simps's bar, where the investigators continued their thorough examination. There they also managed to find a hair clip that Helen's mother identified as the one with which the young woman had gone to work that morning. Another important piece of evidence was found in the bar. A strand of a woman's hair whose belonging to Helen was confirmed by analysis. Nevertheless, the investigators continued searching for new clues and sent the young woman's found clothing for examination. The experts discovered carpet fibers on it that were identical to those in the George and Dragon bar. They also found traces of Ian's dog hair on the clothing. Subsequently, the experts examined 2 rings and a bracelet that had been taken from the man after his arrest. On them, they found earth traces that matched the soil from the area where the soiled towels and George's things had previously been found. Soon, another piece of evidence surfaced. Near the small town of Rixton, 24 kilometers from Billinge, a shovel was found. It turned out that it belonged to Ian Sims and had presumably been used in connection with Helen's disappearance. Despite the efforts of hundreds of volunteers, however, it was still not possible to find the young woman herself. Helen's relatives, given the many pieces of evidence, hardly doubted a sad outcome. However, the lack of final confirmation prevented them from saying goodbye appropriately and being certain that the guilty party would be justly punished. Ian stubbornly denied his involvement in the incident, but ultimately the case was brought to court. The hearings began a year after Helen's disappearance, in February '89. It was one of the first cases in Great Britain where an attempt was made to hold someone accountable without the missing person being found. Therefore, despite the impressive evidence, the prosecution doubted success. According to their version, Helen got off the bus that evening and went home on her usual route. As she passed the pub George and Dragon, she attracted the attention of Ian Sims, who began a conversation under some pretext. Possibly the man wanted to discuss the incident due to which he had banned her from visiting his establishment. The investigators suspected that Ian might have offered Helen to settle the conflict and lift the ban from the pub. Considering that this was almost the only place in Billinge that Helen could visit with friends, she was interested in solving the problem. Apparently, the man invited her into the establishment, where there were no more guests at that time. Shortly thereafter, something unexpected happened, which is confirmed by the statement of a random passerby. A female scream reached him, which quickly fell silent. After the meeting with Helen, Ian used a piece of electrical cable and brought her to his apartment on the 2nd floor. There, something unpleasant possibly happened, after which he waited until dawn and brought Helen to the car. The man drove her far away from Billing and hid her, then distributed her things, his clothes and other objects in various remote locations. There were several assumptions about his motives. The first was of a personal nature. From the reports of many witnesses, the investigators knew that Ian had repeatedly shown interest in the young woman, but she had always rejected him. Possibly he saw a chance that evening to put his unpleasant intentions into action. The second assumption was that during the conversation between them, a misunderstanding arose and he harmed her in anger. It cannot be ruled out that he and Helen began to argue and she threatened to tell his wife about his constant attempts at approach. But this version seemed less credible. After the charges were brought to court, it was Ian's turn. He continued to protest his complete innocence and presented his version, and it was one of the most unusual appearances of a person accused of such a serious offense. The man claimed that someone had set him up. Someone had broken into his bar, put on his clothes, lured Helen there and caused her suffering, then loaded her into Ian's car and hidden her in an unknown location, using Ian's own tools. After that, the perpetrator had brought the car back to the bar and disappeared, casting suspicion on the innocent owner of the pub. Such strange statements only strengthened the jury's conviction that Ian was involved in the incident. His story seemed completely unbelievable. Possibly he decided, given the probability of a harsh sentence, to mock the justice system and Helen's relatives. Finally, Ian was found guilty on the 14th of March of the same year. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the possibility of applying for early release no earlier than after 16 years. Unfortunately, the trials for Helen's relatives did not end there. Law enforcement agencies and volunteers continued the search, but unsuccessfully. 3 years after the verdict was announced, the young woman's mother sent Ian a letter. She begged him to tell her where her daughter was located. After some time came a response, which however contained only insults and threats. Ian promised to take revenge on the woman as soon as he was released from prison. He appealed several times, but all were rejected. Only in the year 2004, when Ian had already spent 15 years behind bars, one of the appeals was granted and the case was sent back for review. However, this decision proved by no means in his favor. Modern analysis of genetic material enabled experts to examine the evidence and come to a clear conclusion about Ian's involvement in the incident. As a result of the case review, his prison time actually extended. After 16 years, Ian tried several times to achieve early release, but all his applications were rejected. Meanwhile, Helen's relatives did not give up their efforts to learn her whereabouts. In the year 2015, the young woman's mother launched a public campaign to change the existing legislation. She proposed to deprive convicted persons of the right to early release as long as they do not reveal the location of the missing person. The woman actively communicated with the media, appealed to Prime Minister Theresa May, and organized a petition that was supported by hundreds of thousands of people. Thanks to her efforts, the matter was discussed in Parliament, and initially politicians evaluated the possibility of passing such a law positively. However, the process dragged on, and the initiative was repeatedly postponed. All these delays led to Ian Sims finally receiving early release in November 2019 after 30 years of imprisonment. This was a severe blow to Helen's family, as they had practically lost hope of learning her whereabouts. 3 months after the decision, the 63-year-old Ian Sims was released and returned to normal life. Unfortunately, his time in freedom was only brief. At the end of June 2022, the man died due to illness without having revealed the secret of Helen's whereabouts. The young woman's mother, still full of determination, does not give up hope. Now she hopes that Ian might possibly have shared information with one of his fellow inmates. Furthermore, she continues to fight for the passage of a law that would prevent early release of convicted persons if they refuse to reveal the location of missing persons. Thus, the story of Helen McCourt extends over decades, although the case itself was solved in the shortest time. Despite irrefutable evidence against the guilty party, he stubbornly maintained silence about important details that would have allowed Helen's relatives to say goodbye and begin healing their emotional wounds.